Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're staring down a fascinating, maybe sometimes unsettling, collection of information on the COVID-19 pandemic response and, well, its fallout.
Yeah, I've got quite a mix.
We do. We've got claims of outright misinformation from supposed experts, a look at why some folks in Nigeria viewed the whole thing with deep suspicion,
Right.
and the truly mind-boggling levels of fraud in pandemic relief programs.
It's quite something.
Plus, a former insider is now saying the vaccine rollout wasn't exactly, on the up and up. So our mission today is really to pull out the essential need-to-know insights for you from all of this.
Exactly. We're diving into a video from the Daily Signal. It lays out what they claim are 10 specific times experts flat out lied about COVID, and they say they have receipts.
Okay.
Then we'll shift continents to Nigeria. Looking at a TVC News Nigeria report that explores why a significant number of people there were highly skeptical about the virus, its existence, its severity. We also have two discussions, one from the House Committee on Small Business and another on the Hill, both digging into the massive fraud, just massive, with COVID relief funds.
Right, the relief money.
And finally, we'll hear from Deborah Birx on the Hill, key player in the U.S. pandemic response. Now, admitting the way the COVID-19 vaccines were presented was, in her words, a lie.
A lie. Wow.
And that the science didn't always guide the rollout.
So for you, the learner, we're going to try and, weave these different threads together.
Yeah.
We want to pinpoint the potential contradictions, flag the really concerning issues that come up, and ultimately give you a much clearer picture of the controversies and complexities around the pandemic response without hopefully drowning you in all the details.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with these allegations of expert misinformation, this Daily Signal video has this list, right? 10 things.
Yeah, 10 points.
As you look at these initial claims, what kind of jumps out at you just in terms of how the whole narrative around the pandemic seemed to shift?
Well, what's interesting right off the bat is how many of these claims really touch on shifts in guidance or just shifts in understanding over time.
Okay.
Take the very first one they list, 15 days to slow the spread.
Right.
Morphing into much longer restrictions with sort of no clear end date sometimes.
Yeah, I remember that feeling.
It immediately brings up that challenge, doesn't it? Communicating in a crisis where the situation is just constantly changing. Were those initial short-term frames maybe too simple?
Yeah.
And did they end up undermining trust when things dragged on?
That's a really good point. And then they bring up the mask issue. The CDC initially saying, no masks needed for the general public.
Right.
Then doing a complete 180. That kind of reversal, that definitely fueled a lot of confusion and, like you said, probably chipped away at people's confidence.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, these changes, even if they were based on new data coming in, they can easily be seen as uncertainty. Or worse, maybe incompetence.
Yeah.
And the next claim they make about President Biden initially saying no to vaccine mandates but then implementing them, that highlights a different kind of tension, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, the push and pull between, individual freedoms and what's seen as the greater good in a public health emergency.
Gotcha. And the whole debate around where the virus came from is right there, too.
Okay.
The initial focus on the wet market, then the lab leak theory starts gaining traction. And these accusations that Dr. Fauci tried to downplay that possibility, it's become so politically charged now, it's hard to know what to make of it sometimes.
It really have. And this raises a fundamental question, I think, about how scientific inquiries get done and how they're communicated, especially when they touch on really sensitive areas, things with potentially huge geopolitical implications.
Definitely.
The Daily Signal also points to school closures. They argue they were driven more by fear than solid evidence of, kids spreading it widely.
That was another really, really contentious issue. Huge impact on families, on kids' development.
Huge.
Yeah.
And then they get into the claims that, if you were vaccinated, you wouldn't get COVID-19.
Which we now know wasn't quite right, especially with the later variants.
Exactly. It feels like there was perhaps an oversimplification early on about what the vaccines could actually do. That they would do.
Yeah, seems like it.
The initial hope, maybe, that vaccines would be this silver bullet just stopping transmission completely, that seems to have collided pretty hard with the reality of, virus is evolving. And that gap between what people expected initially and what happened later likely added to that feeling that people were misled.
Makes sense.
They also mentioned how women's concerns about menstrual changes after vaccination were dismissed initially.
Oh, right. I remember that.
And then later, a study did acknowledge a slight change in cycle length. It kind of underscores the importance of listening to and investigating all reported health effects, doesn't it? Even if they seem anecdotal at first.
Absolutely. Listen to people. And the idea that vaccination would just end the pandemic and mask mandates that didn't pan out either, did it?
No. As new variants popped up, restrictions sometimes came back, which again probably left people feeling like the rules kept changing, the goalposts were always shifting.
Yeah, confusing. Then there's the really serious accusation about gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Right, that's a heavy one.
The NIH admitted funding research that created a more dangerous virus in mice, which seems to contradict Dr. Fauci's earlier denials pretty directly. It's pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and it really highlights the complexities and maybe the potential risks tied to certain types of scientific research.
Yeah.
And the need for really clear, transparent communication about it.
Transparency.
Finally, the video points to times when Biden and Fauci seemed to blame unvaccinated people for outbreaks, even when breakthrough cases were clearly happening. That kind of messaging could easily create division, couldn't it? Instead of, fostering a unified approach.
Okay, quite a list there. Now let's do a real shift. Let's talk about Nigeria. The perception of COVID-19 there, as reported by TVC News Nigeria, it suggests this widespread belief among some Nigerians that COVID was just a big scam, that precautions were pointless. It's almost hard to reconcile with what was happening elsewhere globally.
It is striking, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shows the power of local context and just personal experience in shaping how people understand a huge global event.
How so?
Well, even with reported cases and deaths in Nigeria, if people in their own immediate circles weren't seeing widespread severe illness,
Right.
it's kind of understandable how skepticism could take root. The report really highlights that disconnect the official statistics versus what people were seeing or not seeing day to day.
And this was happening even as medical professionals in Nigeria were sounding the alarm, especially given things like high population density in Lagos and lots of other health issues like malaria, hypertension, diabetes.
Exactly. Those underlying conditions could have made COVID-19 much more dangerous there. Doctors like Imi Okan and Professor Larry Adaimo, they clearly articulated the ongoing risk. They saw the potential for a really significant impact, even if case numbers seemed to be dropping at that point.
So why were they dropping, or seeming to?
Well, Professor Adaimo mentioned reduced testing rates could be part of it, but he really emphasized the need for community leaders to step in, to reinforce the message that the risk was still there.
Ah, okay.
It underscores that effective public health communication often has to be, culturally sensitive, locally driven, not just top-down.
That makes a lot of sense. The report also briefly touches on the global effort to develop vaccines and concerns about side effects. Maybe that uncertainty, the speed of it all, also fueled the skepticism.
Oh, very likely. I mean, anytime new medical treatments are rolled out that quickly, concerns about safety are just natural.
True.
This report hints at that underlying caution, that desire to see thorough testing before everyone jumps on board. The situation in Nigeria really just highlights how differently the pandemic was experienced and interpreted around the world.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move on to something else entirely, something that affects us all as taxpayers. This massive fraud in COVID-19 relief funds. The discussions from the House Committee on Small Business and the Hill, they paint a truly shocking picture, just how much money vanished.
Yeah, the scale is.
Congressman Roger Williams throws around a number $200 billion, potentially lost just from the small business loan programs.
The scale of the alleged fraud is, staggering. Congressman Williams points out that a federal watchdog found the Small Business Administration, the SBA, basically weakened its own controls.
Making it easier for fraudsters.
Essentially, yeah. Making it easier for them to get their hands on the funds. The estimate they cite, 17% of the $1.2 trillion distributed potentially being fraudulent. That's a huge red flag, just huge.
And he says about 1 in 5 loans looked suspicious. He talks about a lack of basic safeguards, money going overseas, people using completely fake information. It sounds like the system was just incredibly vulnerable.
It certainly sounds like it was. Now, Congressman Williams does acknowledge the emergency situation, the need to get money out fast.
Sure.
But he rightly points to the critical need now to try and recover these funds. And, just as importantly, put much stronger oversight in place for any future emergency spending.
We need better guardrails next time.
Absolutely. The fact that the Justice Department has brought charges against, I think he said over 1,000 people, shows they're trying to address it. Yeah. But the sheer volume, it makes the task incredibly difficult.
Yeah, 1,000 sounds like a lot, but compared to $200 billion.
Exactly.
Then we have Stuart Whitson talking about the unemployment benefit fraud on the Hill, and the numbers there are equally eye-opening, an estimated $135 billion lost.
Another staggering number.
And the recovery rate is just dismal, only about 5%. $6.8 billion recovered out of $135 billion.
That low recovery rate is certainly concerning,
Yeah.
especially as Whitson points out with the statute of limitations approaching for some of this.
Hey, time is running out.
He details the different ways the fraud happened. People double-dipping, claiming benefits while working, claiming in multiple states, and even sophisticated criminal organizations using stolen identities on a massive scale. Transnational crime.
Wow. Why so little recovered, does he say?
He suggests one potential reason was the Justice Department might have been focused on other priorities, which, if true, raises questions about resource allocation when you're dealing with such massive financial losses to the public. He argues for extending the statute of limitations.
To give them more time.
Yeah, to allow for more investigation, more prosecution.
He also points to just the initial chaos, right? The urgency of getting money out.
Yes, that's a key factor he brings up. That speed, while maybe necessary to help people quickly, likely came at the cost of robust checks, robust verification.
And criminals just jumped right in.
Unfortunately, yes. Criminal organizations were quick to exploit that chaos. And he suggests the prolonged nature of the emergency, plus maybe not enough oversight along the way, just made things worse over time.
It sounds like a perfect storm for fraud.
It does. Whitson also mentions the idea of maybe recouping unused funds from businesses that got aid but didn't end up needing it all.
Ah, interesting. Another potential way to get some money back.
Potentially, yeah. Offers another avenue, maybe, for recovering some taxpayer dollars.
Okay, finally, let's get to this Deborah Birx interview on the Hill. This is, I think, arguably the most surprising part of our discussion today.
It certainly generated a lot of discussion.
Yeah. A former White House coronavirus response coordinator admitting that the way the vaccines were presented to the public was flawed, even calling it a lie.
Her central point, as I understand it, is that the public health messaging didn't clearly differentiate these COVID-19 vaccines from, say, traditional childhood vaccines.
Like measles.
Right, exactly. Vaccines that typically prevent infection altogether. She says the emphasis should have been on their main benefit, reducing severe illness and death, especially in high-risk groups.
And she thinks this lack of clarity contributed to vaccine hesitancy.
She does. She notes hesitancy rates have actually doubled since the pandemic began, which is worrying. And she also criticizes what she saw as this sort of unspoken goal of achieving zero COVID just through vaccination.
Which wasn't realistic.
Apparently not. And she feels people who question that strategy were maybe unfairly labeled as anti-vax. What's particularly notable, though, is her assertion that the vaccine rollout itself wasn't always guided strictly by the science.
What does she mean?
She argues the mRNA vaccines should have been prioritized first for older adults, people with underlying conditions, the highest risk groups.
Okay.
And that vaccinating younger, lower risk people before getting to everyone in nursing homes, for example, she argues that Mickey's is not following the science and the data.
That's a strong claim from someone who is on the inside.
It is. Although the commentator in that video piece makes a really sharp observation, too.
What did that?
Pointing out that, well, Burris is now criticizing the government response as if she wasn't a key part of it herself.
Right. She and Dr. Fauci were pretty much front and center, weren't they?
They were. They were central figures shaping that response. So it does make you wonder a bit about accountability, maybe the timing of these kinds of admissions.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
But her current perspective, regardless of her past role, does offer a critical look back. The comparison made to the flu vaccine is helpful, I think.
So?
Well, the flu vaccine reduces severity, helps keep people out of the hospital, but doesn't always stop you from getting the flu, right?
Right.
Maybe expectations for the COVID vaccines weren't set clearly enough along those lines. And as the commentator also notes, those constantly changing rules and restrictions we talked about earlier, that likely eroded public trust over time, too.
Okay. So as we bring this deep dive to a close, we've covered a lot of ground here.
We certainly have.
We've looked at these serious accusations of misinformation coming from authorities, significant skepticism about the virus itself in Nigeria, the Just staggering amount of fraud in the pandemic relief programs.
Yeah, billions and billions.
And maybe most significantly, we have a former top health advisor now saying the public was, well, misled about the vaccines and that the rollout might have missed the mark scientifically in some key areas.
These diverse perspectives really underscore the immense challenges involved in responding to a global pandemic, don't they? Navigating science that's evolving in real time, communicating effectively with all sorts of different populations, and trying to manage huge sums of public money responsibly under pressure.
It's a lot to juggle. So considering these different accounts, especially these admissions around vaccine effectiveness and the rollout strategy, what does this all mean for the future? For public trust in our health institutions and government agencies?
That's the big question, isn't it?
How do we ensure more transparency, more accuracy in communication during the next health crisis? Because there probably will be one. It leaves you, the learner, with some really important questions, I think, to consider about accountability, about scientific integrity, and just the lessons we can actually draw from this unprecedented global event.
Lots to think about.
Tell me sweet little lies.